everybody. Apologies for my absence today and how I sound right now. Um, as you can tell, I'm very sick. It is very easy to get sick when you have a 2-year-old housemate who hasn't learned germ theory yet, so my apologies. Hopefully, though, as we get further into the year, she gets older and gets more of an immune system. What I normally do when I'm away, just so I don't miss any class time, is record videos of what I would say if I was there in class with you in the booklet. Okay? So I'm going to promise this every time, but something I do in the past to allow me not to miss too much school. Well, not too much teaching, I guess. I still miss the school. Anyway, our next dot point. Hopefully went well with those questions here. Hopefully enough time. But we do have to rush forward as well. So we're into the next section. We've done the survey. We know where we're coming from, the environment that the Paris Peace Conference created in Europe, and now we're going to look at the rise of dictatorships after World War One. Big part of this whole topic is understanding, well, how come those dictators were able to rise? So the first dot point as part of that section is the conditions that enabled dictators to rise to power in the interwar period. There's a PowerPoint on the website too. We'll go through that when I get back, but I just thought I'd give you the content now. So, the three countries, the three countries that produced the most famous right-wing dictatorships after the First World War, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were all dissatisfied when they left the Paris Peace Conference, as was the new left-wing communist dictatorship in Russia, the Bolsheviks, which had been banned from the conference. It would be wrong, however, to assume that this dissatisfaction was the primary cause for the rise of any of these dictatorships. Rather, there were specific local, national, social, economic, and cultural factors at work in each of these countries that played a part in the rejection of the democratic governments. Furthermore, it would also be wrong to view all four of these dictatorships as the same. The dot point after this goes through each of the dictatorships in detail to show you what they looked like, so we'll get a good glimpse at how they all differ from each other. Like it says here, each of them was unique. The factors that led to the rise of communism and Stalin's dictatorship were very different from the circumstances in Italy that saw Benito Mussolini become dictator. All these societies did, however, have two things in common. They all rejected democratic values, and they placed their loyalty to the state above the rights and freedoms of individuals. So they put all their investment in the state, or the country, the government, the politics, the parliament, and in our case, the dictators, above their own rights and freedoms. They were willing to give up their own rights and freedoms for the greater good. So, what were those conditions? Well, starting with a huge one, the Great Depression. The hope of a lasting peace and continued economic prosperity was the promise of the Golden 20s. And that was shattered by the Great Depression of the 1930s. It started in October 29, but the impacts were felt across the world in the 30s. So across the world, living standards fell, businesses closed, and unemployment soared to record highs. The Great Depression had its roots in World War One. European economies had collapsed under the economic strain of 4 long years of fighting. The USA had come to Europe's aid with a large loan to the Allies, Germany, and many other nations who also borrowed heavily from the USA. In October 29, the Wall Street American stock market crash occurred. Americans immediately lost economic confidence and called in all their loans from European nations. This had a catastrophic knock-on effect. Basically, America was so consistently wealthy during that period that they loaned a whole heap of countries money to help them fight the war effort. However, once America started getting shaky, they started making those countries give that money back, pay their loans off, rather than be so generous and be like, yeah, pay it next time. And when those countries started saying, well, we don't actually have that money to pay you back, the American stock market had overreached, and therefore they started getting worried. And it had this domino effect of not having enough money because it had given out too much, leading to closing of banks, businesses shutting down, huge loss of employment, and just that flowed on to all the other parts of the world because America was so dominant. Now, this had a catastrophic knock-on effect. Many banks closed their doors as people rushed them for their savings. Large companies collapsed. Unemployment rose to staggering heights. As the world economy buckled, people felt threatened and insecure, and began to question if democratic governments were able to fix the worsening social and economic problems. Many people were ready to listen to any party or individual who offered answers. The situation created the perfect atmosphere for dictators to rise to power. So, democratic governments were not working in their eyes. So they were now open to, well, what else could work? If democratic governments don't work, what could? So in Russia, powerful communist communist dictatorship led by Joseph Stalin ruled with an iron fist. In Italy, Benito Mussolini was swept to power on a wave of support for his fascist principles of authoritarian control of the state. And Japan, in a military dictatorship, was ruled by military leaders. They replaced the former democratic system of government, and the emperor became a god-like figure. As with any period of economic instability, people in Europe soon began to question existing institutions. Uncertainty and change have always proved fertile ground for extremists with radical solutions to everyday problems. This saw challenges to moderate, middle-of-the-road politicians, especially in Germany and Italy. These challenges came from both sides of politics. On the one side, there was communist parties, inspired by the success of the revolution in 17 in Russia, and the promise of a new class of society. With the whole economic system falling around them, wouldn't a classless society be good, they thought. On the other side, there were the right-wing anti-communist groups, such as the Fascist Party in Italy and the Nazis and other militarist right-wing groups in Germany. Excuse me. In summary, as well as the toll of World War I, Paris Peace Conference, and the Great Depression, there were a range of conditions that enabled the rise of dictators. These include collapse of authoritarian rule. Empires all over Europe were collapsing. This led to an ongoing uncertainty and instability because what was known was now becoming unknown. The empires that had that kind of clear authoritarian rule, usually in the form of a monarch, were collapsing. So this power struggle was coming out of that. Whatever political, social, and nationalist or ethnic tensions existed prior to the war, the authoritarian rulers of these empires had kept a lid on them. After the empires collapsed, all of these tensions came to the surface. We talked about it a bit when we talked about the creation of those new countries in Europe during the Paris Peace Conference. Liberal democracy did not have firm roots in the former empires. The processes of democracy were poorly developed. Parliaments were sometimes regarded as ineffectual talking shops. All talk, no action. These processes and parliaments struggled to deal with the challenges of interwar years. When these politicians struggled to establish democracy as the replacement to these authoritarian regimes and the old right elites that they kind of used to go by, new right groups emerged under populist leaders like Adolf Hitler. The new right appealed for mass support by offering extremist solutions to the problems faced by World War I European societies. So the old right, in terms of the monarchic authoritarian regimes, just weren't quite cutting the mustard with the new right movement, the people who had experienced the war and wanted something similar to what was before the war, but a bit different, a bit more modern. And populist leaders like Hitler brought that out. There was also the fear of the spread of revolutionary communism, combined with the apparent failure of liberal democratic capitalism, seemingly evident in the Great Depression, made extreme right-wing solutions appear attractive. One of the best names we have for an historian, Odd Arnie Westad, in his book Cold War, A World History, wrote, "Capitalism had a very bad run in the first half of the 20th century. It was easy to inflame world opinion against it and in favour of ideals of social justice and defence of local communities, even when such values were presented by thugs and murderers." Cue the SA for the Nazis. Nationalism, I feel like we've talked about that enough, and normally if I'd have taught you guys year 11, I've gone through this in a bit more detail. But if you have any more questions about nationalism, you can ask me when we get back. It was the appeals to this nationalism and aggressive nationalist responses to the challenges of the interwar period that were common to all right-wing groups. Nationalism undermined efforts to promote an internationalist outlook and could also be part of a complex reaction against modernity. So, that reaction to modernity. Modernity is a broad concept associated with a world of rapid change that was one of the lasting consequences of the Industrial Revolution. In the earlier 20th century, the spread of modernity set up sharp divisions by those who had embraced it and appeared to benefit from it, those who were disturbed by it or left behind. Remember, I was talking about that idea of the conservatives liking what things used to be like. They're the ones who kind of were disturbed by it, and traditionally the more progressive and commonly young people embrace this internationalist modern look at things. Excuse me, I'm so sorry about how sick I sound in this. Rapid economic, political and social change was disruptive and set up sharp tensions. In the eyes of many conservatives, those who took on more liberal social attitudes, supported modernist art forms, or indulged in new popular entertainments and leisure activities appeared to be turning their backs on traditional social and religious values. For example, there were independent new women in Europe, and the flamboyant modern boys, or mobo, and modern girls, moga, in Japan, who challenged conservative outlooks. Divisions were highlighted by the fact that modernity was associated with large urban centres, while regional and rural areas remained relatively unchanged. These divisions were exploited by those who pointed to the supposed decadence, or decadence is like a fancier than you need to go, is a very bad way of explaining that. Materialism and self-indulgence of modern culture and linked it to the ineffectiveness of democracy. They contrasted this with the more traditional values of loyalty, service, and at least for the lower classes, frugality, or being good with your money, not spending too much, and linked this with the need for more national discipline and decisive leadership. So at the time, it made sense to them, but to us it's a bit interesting, the idea of this modern boy, modern girl, new woman, spending your money, having an internationalist approach, was seen as a threat to those traditional values. Right? People just don't work as hard as they used to. Everyone has all these problems. That kind of argument that you hear all the time these days was happening back then as well. Despite being a phenomenon of the modern era, nationalism was generally opposed to modernity. Modernity was linked to internationalism and pacifism, or the idea of not fighting for what you want, and appeared to elevate self-indulgence over service and state. That's a good line there, if I do say so myself. Anti-Semitism also prospered during these anti-modernity times for two reasons. Populist politicians targeted Jewish people as scapegoats for the range of problems afflicting society. Additionally, it appeared that Jewish people were prospering under modernity. Not only did they enjoy greater equality wherever liberalism spread, but they appeared to be prominent in many areas associated with modernity. Examples include being the owners of Germany's first department stores, influential filmmakers, and leading figures in internationalist ideologies. As a group who appear to thrive under modernity and have internationalist rather than nationalist loyalties, Jewish people were singled out by right-wing nationalists as being a particular danger to national states. What you'll find is, with these authoritarian rulers, there has to be an enemy. There has to be something to unite the people against. And when it comes to modernity, the Jewish people represented that. So they were seen as too indulgent, too selfish, and that was the common enemy we should rally behind as a way of uniting us against a common cause. Economic hardship, we've already talked about in the Depression paragraph. And then the failure of the League of Nations. This beautiful group that was set up post-Paris Peace Conference to handle the peace of the world, and how it did not do that. As we will see, the League of Nations failed to stop the aggression of dictatorial regimes in the 30s. It proved incapable of either defending the flawed 1919 peace settlement or of putting the ideal of internationalism into practice in any effective way when confronted by the aggressive nationalism of Japan, Italy, and Germany. We look at this in a bit more detail in our third topic, the conflict in Europe, when we look at the failures of the League of Nations more specifically. So we'll get to that. While acknowledging its role in settling minor disputes between smaller powers, Eric Hobsbawm is dismissive of the League as an almost total failure, except as an institution for collecting statistics, which for an historian is a real sick burn right there. Even though the League cannot be blamed for the rise of dictators, its failure to oppose their aggressions contributed to their early foreign policy successes, which in turn helped consolidate their power at home. Now to finish this dot point, let's go out with our old RO, Richard Overy, big dog himself, in his book, The Interwar Crisis. For all the popular expectations of a new order based on democracy at home and responsible collaboration abroad, the war left too many loose ends, too many bitter legacies. Besides the hopes of pacifist internationalism, there stood outraged nationalism. Beside confidence in democracy and social justice stood a yearning for harsh, counter-revolutionary authority. Beside the indulgent materialism of the age of jazz and fast cars, could be found a conservative intelligentsia which despaired of reviving spiritual values and arresting racial impoverishment. The post-war was full of unresolved disputes. Now here are two example HSC questions, as you can read. They're all very similar for this dot point. It's identify or outline. So I've given you the outline one to complete. All right, simple as, that's the space you're normally given. 4 points, which means you should, when it comes to a word like outline, you identify the condition and you briefly describe the impact it had or the context around it. Okay, so for example, you might have reaction to modernity, and you might talk about the conservatives having issues with the decadence and self-indulgence of a certain part of the population, while everything seemed to be falling down around them. Safe to say, if you got 4, have a crack at 4. It'd be hard to not get full marks if you outline 4 different conditions. Okay, if you just do 1 or 2, you're not going to get the full marks. That's why the spacing is so important, because you might need to be more succinct than you currently are. That's just something to practice. But then we shift into one of my questions. Which 2 conditions from the list above do you feel were most influential in facilitating the rise of dictators, and why? I've given you a page to do that. Okay, so that's the work for today. Again, apologies for not being there and for sounding as horrible as I do. I know this is a very, very bad version of ASMR for you, so I sincerely apologise. Good luck, and I'll see you soon.